it's Alice, and today it's time to wrap up the books that I've read in May. The first book that I read in May was a mystery novel. It was The Appeal by Janice Hallett, and this is set in this small, sleepy town where two newcomers arrive, and we basically get to know everyone in this town through like this amateur play, as well as like a charity appeal for a young girl's medical treatment. And it's clear from the beginning of the story that someone is gonna get murdered, and it's one of those epistolary novels, I think you call them, so the story is sort of presented a little bit differently than usual. I love a good mystery novel, and like I mentioned, because this is written in a little bit of a different way, it felt quite different than a lot of other mystery books that I've read, and so it made it a little bit extra fun to read. This isn't written in letters. Everything is like email, texts, chats, and notes and stuff like that, and so everything that you hear is from the characters in the book, and they're like talking to each other, and that's how you get to know the characters and figure out what's going on. And some of the characters you hear from a lot, some of them you don't hear from at all. You just hear about them through other people's conversations, and I think that's a very interesting way of structuring a book, because everything is clouded by whatever character is writing an email or whatever, like by their perspective and their opinion, and so you have to be quite critical of everything that you're reading, and some stuff is like left out, and because there are some characters that you don't hear from, it's hard to figure out what's going on, but in the best way. It did not take me long to get sucked into this book, although it did take me a little while to sort out all of the characters, because there are just a lot of them. And like it says on the cover here, there are 15 suspects, and that's not even all of the characters in the book. And so it took me a while to get that sorted out. There are a couple of like lists that appear throughout the book of most of the characters, and I tabbed one of those in the beginning of the book, like the first one that appeared, and that was very helpful. So I kept like flipping back to that list because there are a lot of people in this book and it gets a little bit confusing. The mystery in here is really intriguing, and it's the kind of book where from the beginning you know that someone is gonna get murdered, but you don't actually know who until about halfway through the book. And so there's the tension of that, but then there's also a lot of other shady stuff going on in this book that you're like trying to figure out. And so there's a lot going on and a lot to sort of get invested in. I'm not usually the kind of reader who can figure out like who has done it unless it's very, very obvious. And in this one, it really wasn't. It was very twisty, and there's a lot of like shifty people in this book, and you sort of get one impression of a character from one person, but then another from someone else. And it's just there's just a lot going on and a lot of characters. And what I think is really fun about books being written in this way is that it sort of encourages you to try to figure things out by yourself, which I think is really cool. I couldn't figure it out, but it was really fun to just try to like find clues and try to figure some of it out. I think this is a pretty clever book, and it's very easy to get invested in and sucked into, and it was just a very enjoyable reading experience. It is a little bit confusing at first, and there are some parts where things slow down a little bit, but overall it felt very compulsive and fast-paced, and I think it's a very interesting mystery, and it's fun to read books that are written in kind of a different way sometimes, so I really enjoyed that as well. And I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. The second book that I read was A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. And this is a historical fiction novel, and it starts off in Moscow in 1922. And we meet this count who has been sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his days. And he is to spend his time in this like grand hotel in the middle of the city where he lives when he's sentenced. And the book is all about him trying to make a life for himself within these walls, all the while some of the most tumultuous decades in Russian history is taking place right outside his door. We read this for my Patreon book club, and I feel like this was a great pick. I thought this was delightful, and I really, really enjoyed it. I think this book does a lot of interesting things in an interesting way. Like, we're taking a look at decades and decades of Russian history, some of it good, some of it really not good. All the while, we're being confined to this quite small space and we're following one person who is stuck inside of it. And you would think that that would make the book feel claustrophobic, but somehow it never really does. We're taken through the daily events of the hotel quite a lot, and we get to know how everything works and everyone that works there, and so that makes the book feel quite intimate. But everything that's going on outside, and there's a lot going on outside, seeps in, as it always does, and that sort of shows us the bigger picture. So you feel like you get this grand picture of everything that's happening, but it also feels quite close and intimate. The main character is also just absolutely delightful, and I loved him, and he's probably my favorite part of the book. He's thrust into this new confined life, but he's quite cheerful and optimistic, and he manages to, for the most part, make the best of it. He has a surprisingly adventurous life for being confined to such a small space, and I just thought seeing everything that came his way was really interesting, and I was really rooting for him, and I just loved him. I do think that maybe the pace of this is a little bit all over the place sometimes, but I was surprised by how much happens in this book. And it was a little bit different than I had expected. I thought that maybe it would be more reflective and more emotional in a way, and I was surprised by how much other stuff happens in this book and how much happens in the main character's life, and it was probably a little bit less emotional than I had expected it. It was a very enjoyable read though, and it's filled with interesting characters and interesting themes, and it just feels to me like a very solid book, so I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. And this is one of those books that I feel is very easy to recommend because it feels like a very accessible read. Then I read Angels and Demons by Dan Brown, and this is a mystery adventure story, and it's the first book in the Robert Langdon series where we follow this professor. And in this book, there is a scientist who has been murdered in the beginning of the book. He's found brutally murdered with this symbol seared into his chest, and they call in Robert Langdon because he is an expert in symbols, and they discover that someone has stolen something from this lab, taken it to Rome, and hidden it just in time for the new Pope election, or papal election, I think you call it. And this thing that has been stolen and hidden is very, very dangerous. And if the main character can't find out what all of these symbols and stuff means, Vatican City will literally just go poof, and probably the Catholic Church along with it. This was actually a reread for me. I read this book ages and ages ago when I was in my late teens, I think, and it was one of my favorite books for a really long time. And then recently I took a trip to Rome, and when I was packing, I saw this book and I was like, I think it's time to reread this because it's set in Rome, and so I took this with me and I had a great time. Now, although this is not a literary masterpiece, man, is this book a lot of fun. I think taking it with me on my trip obviously made it a little bit better, but I'm surprised by how much I really, really enjoyed this. And I think that I was a little bit surprised because I feel like my tastes, my reading tastes, have evolved quite a bit since I read this for the first time, but I still really, really like this. I guess I shouldn't really be that surprised that I still really like this because I love a good adventure story as well as any kind of mystery, and this has religion and science and secret societies and a race against time and a historical puzzle, and all of it is really compelling if you're into that sort of thing. We get to see all of these different places in Rome, which is super fun, and it was extra fun for me because I went on that trip with a friend of mine who knows Rome quite well, and she kept pointing out different places that appear in the book when we were walking around, so that made it extra fun. And the book is surprisingly tense and exciting, and the characters are constantly running out of time, and that makes you just want to keep going. The story is also surprisingly dark, and you might be thinking that I shouldn't be surprised seeing as I've already read this, but I had really forgotten a lot of this book, and I had completely forgotten the end, which is wild. And when I got to the end of this, I was reminded why I loved this book so much the first time I read it. I still think the twist at the end of this is fantastic. Now, the characters in here are pretty good, I think, although not all of them are super well developed, and the person we get to know the most is the main character. And I liked getting to know them throughout the events of the book, but this is definitely more of a plot-driven book than a character-driven one. I am really, really glad that I reread this though. It's a really fun adventure, and it's the kind of book that's very easy to get sucked into. It is a little bit over the top sometimes, and sometimes things are maybe taken a little bit too far, but I feel like if you're really, really into this, you don't even really notice, and you certainly don't really care. It's all just there, and it's all fun and exciting. I think this is the kind of book that's great if you want something that's interesting and exciting and a kind of like adult adventure book, and there is a lot going on in this that's really interesting, and it is quite action-packed, but one of the things I really like about this book is that although there is a lot of action, I don't feel like there's too much of it, and in between all of it, there's also a lot of other interesting stuff going on. I do think this is the kind of book that you have to go into it with the right attitude. Like, this isn't the kind of book where you're gonna stop and like think that, ooh, this is beautifully written. Like, that's not what this book is, and that's okay. Anyways, I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it for what it is, and now I kind of want to revisit more of Brown's books because I've read a lot of them actually, and I used to love them, and now that I've reread this, I think maybe I want to give some of the others a go. I know that this one was my favorite out of all of them back in the day, so I don't know how well I'll fare with the others, but I kind of want to try them. I know some people really, really dislike Brown's work, but I don't know. I kind of like it. I think it's a cool, like, break from reality. Although one thing that really gave me an existential crisis is that this book came out in the year 2000, which is a long time ago. And I feel like I can remember when this book came out in Norwegian, which I think was a few years later, and it's still ages ago. And that makes me freak out a little bit. But either way, really enjoy this. Now I want to reread more of these books. Lastly, I read I Am by Maggie O'Farrell, and this is a nonfiction book. It's a memoir, and it contains 17 essays, each one dealing with a brush with death that the author has had. So we meet the author at different ages and in different locations, and in each one she has had some sort of, like, death has been around in some way. This is my second book by O'Farrell. The first one that I read was Hamnet, and I absolutely love that book, and there is no doubt that this woman can write. This was very interesting though, and I think that the way that this is structured is really interesting. I think that looking at these different types of brushes with death is a very interesting way of looking at a life, and some of the brushes are on the lighter side and some of them are a lot more serious, and so there's a good balance between heavy stuff and less heavy stuff. When I picked this up, I thought that it was going to be like super sad and dark, and it is in parts, but there is also other stuff in here, so I feel like it's balanced pretty well. As with any kind of essay collection, there are some parts that stand out to me more than others, and I especially loved the parts where O'Farrell is sharing with us her experience of being a woman and some of the stuff that comes with that. Like, she has a miscarriage, and there's a whole essay about that that was very moving and impactful, and then there's also one about her being pregnant and giving birth, and all of that was, like, those essays in particular really stuck out to me, and I think they're really gonna stay with me. Although not all of the essays are like that, and not all of them hit me in the same way, every single page in this book is beautifully written. Like, there's just something about the way she writes that I feel just like pulls you in and puts you in the moment with her, and it's just excellent, and I don't know how she does it, but it's amazing. So yeah, I really liked it, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, and I still can't wait to read more of her work. I just gotta like go buy all of her books and just read all of them because she's fantastic. I guess I had a pretty good reading month, seeing as I gave all of the books that I read 4 stars, which is a pretty good rating for me, and it's rare that I read that many 4-star reads in a row, but I guess it was just that kind of month. Now, I'd love to know what you all have been reading lately and what you thought of the books, and as usual, links to my Patreon and other social media will be in the description if you're interested, and I will see you soon. Bye!